They always saw my scrapbooks as a quiet pastime, a harmless indulgence for a woman whose opinions no longer carried weight. They were filled with pressed flowers from long-dead gardens, photographs blurred by the passage of time, and handwritten notes about milestones they'd long forgotten. My family would nod politely when I mentioned them, a patronizing smile playing on their lips, never suspecting that within those unassuming covers, I was meticulously constructing a cage. Every faded inscription, every seemingly trivial clipping, every piece of what they discarded as sentimental fluff, was being reassembled into an undeniable narrative. They saw a fading matriarch lost in her past. I saw myself, quietly, strategically, building their future. But how could they have known that the very things they ignored were the keys to their undoing? My hands, gnarled with age but still capable, moved with a familiar rhythm across the wide, smooth pages. The scent of old paper and fading glue filled the small sunroom, a perfume far more comforting than any expensive concoction Brenda might spray. In here, surrounded by the echoes of a life lived, I wasn't Eleanor Vance, the matriarch whose wisdom was now seen as quaint, or the mother whose advice was politely ignored by Arthur. I was simply me, finding quiet solace in the tangible past. Outside these walls, in the grander, colder rooms of what was once our family home, their lives buzzed with a different kind of energy. Arthur, always chasing the next big deal, rarely sat still. Brenda, his wife, meticulously managed the house, transforming it into a monument of modern taste, each sleek surface a silent rebuke to my worn heirlooms. Owen, my nephew, floated between them, always agreeable, always looking for the easiest path. They moved with an assurance that often left me feeling like a ghost in my own halls, a whisper of a time that had simply ended for them. They'd often peek into my sunroom, their smiles thin, their eyes glancing at my scrapbooks with a mixture of pity and vague amusement. "Still at it, mother?" Arthur would ask, his voice a little too loud, as if I were hard of hearing. Brenda might chime in, "Such a lovely hobby for you, Eleanor." So, nostalgic. They saw pressed flowers, old tickets, faded photographs of family vacations, children's drawings. They saw sentimentality, a harmless way for an old woman to pass the time. They never truly looked. But with each precisely cut photo, each carefully chosen piece of lace, each small, neat inscription I added, I wasn't just preserving memories. I was arranging pieces. I often found myself jotting down dates beside newspaper clippings, little numbers scribbled in the margin that only I understood, marking not just the event itself, but the day someone had said something, or forgotten something important. These weren't merely decorations, they were anchors, small weights in a growing collection of facts. This room, this quiet routine, became my sanctuary, but also something else entirely. It became my quiet trap, built not with steel and bars, but with paper and ink, waiting. What else could I do when my own family saw me as nothing more than a dust-covered relic? The afternoon sun, usually a balm, felt cold on my skin that Tuesday. Arthur had called a family discussion in the main living room, insisting on its urgency, though the agenda remained vague. He always preferred ambiguity when it suited him. Brenda had arranged a platter of delicate pastries, a thin veneer of normalcy over whatever storm was brewing. Owen sat quietly, already adopting his usual posture of a polite observer, his eyes flicking between Arthur and me. Arthur cleared his throat, a sound that always grated on my nerves. "Mother," he began, "we've been looking at the old trust, the one that governs the summer cottage in particular." My ears perked up. The cottage, a small, unassuming place by the lake, held more memories than all the grand rooms of this house combined. It was where my late husband and I had dreamed our first dreams, where Arthur himself had learned to fish. "It's rather outdated," he continued, "and frankly, a bit of a burden on the estate. Brenda and I, along with some legal counsel, have decided it's best to streamline things. To modernize." Brenda nodded, her smile fixed. "It's just administrative, Eleanor. Much more efficient for tax purposes, you understand." "Owen agrees, don't you, dear?" Owen offered a quick, mumbled affirmation, not meeting my gaze. They spoke of streamlining and modernizing, but the words felt like sandpaper against my soul. I listened, my heart slowly turning to lead, as Arthur explained the oversight. The original language, he claimed, made it difficult to manage, too restrictive. Their solution? To dissolve it, folding its assets directly into Arthur's holding company, called Vance Enterprises, effectively cutting any direct claim I, or anyone else, might have had on the cottage itself, replacing it with a vague promise of easier access, if I ever wished to visit. He even mentioned, almost as an aside, how Mr. Albright from Sterling and Company had made the process so straightforward, all decided at a 9 o'clock Tuesday meeting last month. An oversight, they called it. As if years of tradition, of shared joy, of my very comfort, could be condensed into a line item and shuffled away without a thought. The thread, so fine it had been almost invisible for years, the one connecting me to a sense of belonging and familial care, snapped. It wasn't just the cottage, it was the blatant disrespect, the casual dismissal of my place, my history, my very existence, presented with such cheerful finality. The pain was sharp, a familiar ache, but this time, something new ignited within it. A cold, hard resolve. My illusions, those fragile, gossamer things I'd clung to, shattered like thin glass. This wasn't an oversight. This was a statement, delivered with the precision of a surgeon's cut. They had thought me deaf, blind, and foolish. They were about to learn how wrong they were. My hands, still steady, yearned for the glue stick and the empty pages of my waiting scrapbooks. The silence after their pronouncement had been deafening, not because of a lack of sound, but because of the void where my trust used to be. The next morning, I retreated to my sunroom, not for escape, but for embarkation. The scrapbooks, once a refuge, now felt like a secret arsenal. I took out the one filled with memories of the cottage, photos of my husband fishing, Arthur as a small boy building sandcastles, even a pressed Daisy Owen had given me on his first visit. I smoothed a page, contemplating the blank spaces. Their dismissive words still echoed, outdated, burden, administrative. But the meeting with Mr. Albright from Sterling and Company, held at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday last month, stuck in my mind like a burr under a saddle. My late husband had always handled the legal matters, a meticulous man who believed in bulletproof trusts. It seemed improbable that such a carefully constructed document would simply be outdated, without a more deliberate hand at play. My fingers, no longer gnarled but steady with a quiet purpose, found a small, unused corner on a page beside a photograph of the cottage taken decades ago. I pulled out a fine-tipped pen. I began to write, not about memories but about facts. Mr. Albright, Sterling and Company Tuesday, 9 a.m., last month. I wrote it small, neat, almost invisible against the backdrop of a vibrant summer sky captured in the photograph. Then I added, Arthur's oversight, explained away. My earlier jottings, mere observations of forgotten anniversaries or peculiar remarks, now took on a new weight. I started flipping through other scrapbooks, the ones dedicated to family gatherings, birthdays, Christmases. Arthur had always been expansive, making grand gestures when it suited him, then forgetting the details almost immediately. Brenda, ever the organizer, often took charge of logistics, from seating charts to gift lists. Owen, bless his heart, often seemed to be in the wrong place at the right time, a silent witness to many an awkward family moment. I remembered a conversation from last autumn, at Arthur's birthday dinner, when he'd been particularly boisterous after too much wine. He'd spoken of a big win at Vance Enterprises, something that required a quick restructuring to capitalize on. Brenda had quickly shushed him, shooting me a nervous glance. I'd thought nothing of it then, merely a tipsy boast. Now, I carefully noted, Arthur's boast, big win, quick restructuring, late October. Birthday dinner. I looked at it, small and insignificant on the page. Just a scrap of truth, tucked away like a pressed flower, waiting for the right moment to bloom. They had overlooked these pages for so long. They never saw the garden I was planting. My sunroom, once a haven of gentle memories, had transformed into a war room of paper and glue. The notes I'd scrawled, once disparate flecks on the vibrant canvases of my past, now felt like breadcrumbs leading into a dark wood. I revisited the entry about Mr. Albright from Sterling and Company, the 9 o'clock Tuesday meeting last month where my cottage trust had been dissected and swept away. That meeting wasn't random. Nothing Arthur did was truly random, only ever disguised as such. I pulled out the scrapbook dedicated to recent family events, flipping to the page where Arthur's tipsy boast from his birthday dinner was quietly recorded, big win, quick restructuring, for Vance Enterprises. The October date glared at me. A thought, thin as a spider's silk, began to stretch across the seemingly empty space between these two facts. My late husband, God rest his meticulous soul, had designed that trust like a fortress. He'd often said it would take an act of Congress, or a very clever lawyer, to dismantle it without express consent. My eyes narrowed, catching a glint of something almost imperceptible. A tiny, embossed logo on the edge of a faded receipt tucked into that same October page. It was for a celebratory dinner one Arthur and Brenda had hosted shortly after his birthday. The logo, barely visible, belonged to a lesser-known corporate law firm, Blackwood and Associates. Why would Arthur, with his insistence on Sterling and Company, for our family affairs, be celebrating with another legal firm? A cold dread seeped into my bones, a sensation far more chilling than the thought of mere oversight. This wasn't just about the cottage, or the trust being outdated. This was a strategy. Arthur's big win in October must have required a certain financial profile, a specific, unencumbered asset base. The cottage trust, with its stringent, protective clauses, would have been an obstacle, not a burden to be merely streamlined. The lawyers from Blackwood and Associates would have advised him on how to legally bypass, or rather, quietly dismantle, my husband's bulletproof trust. Then, once the groundwork was laid, Mr. Albright and Sterling and Company would step in to finalize the transfer, lending the process a veneer of legitimate, familial care. The pieces clicked into place with an unnerving precision. It was like watching a film in slow motion, where every innocuous gesture suddenly revealed a malicious intent. The casual dismissal, the vague explanations, Brenda's nervous glance, they weren't signs of neglect but of a meticulously crafted lie. My family wasn't just overlooking me, they were orchestrating a quiet robbery, using my supposed senescence as their cover. The fabricated stories they fed me, about administrative ease and tax efficiency, crumbled like dry leaves in my mind. This wasn't an oversight, this was a plan, woven with cunning and disregard. The sunroom, once a gentle repository for my cherished past, had become my diligent workshop. The scrapbooks, growing heavy with more than just faded photographs, lay open across my large work table, each page a section of an unfolding blueprint. I wasn't merely collecting memories anymore, I was building a case, brick by painstaking brick. My daily ritual began with reviewing the entries, the precise date of the Sterling and Company meeting, Arthur's blustering words about a big win, and the tiny, damning logo of Blackwood and Associates on a discarded receipt. I procured a fresh, crisp notebook, small enough to fit into my cardigan pocket, for new, immediate observations. It felt like an extension of my scrapbooks, a field journal for the present. I started listening more acutely during family meals, noting not just what was said, but how. Arthur often spoke in generalities, but when pressed, he'd deflect with irritable impatience. Brenda, on the other hand, had a habit of over-explaining, adding unnecessary details that, under scrutiny, sometimes contradicted themselves. Owen, as always, remained a shadow, agreeing with whoever spoke last, but his quietness, I now realized, could also be a form of complicity. My routine changed. I subscribed to a local business newspaper, discreetly delivered to my sunroom before anyone else stirred. I began cross-referencing Arthur's timeline. That big win he'd hinted at? I found an article about Vance Enterprises acquiring a struggling local manufacturing plant in late October. The piece mentioned a substantial government contract tied to the acquisition, contingent on strict environmental compliance. I carefully clipped the article, noting the exact date of publication and underlining a small detail about a compliance review deadline, mentioned in passing. It seemed innocuous, a piece of public information that could have meant anything. But I carefully affixed it into my scrapbook next to Arthur's boast, a silent question mark. Each fact was a new rivet in my ironclad record. I no longer sought comfort in these pages, but an almost cold satisfaction in the precision of my growing ledger. This was not about revenge born of hot anger, but justice forged in the cool, methodical accumulation of truth. They saw me absorbed in my little paper world, a harmless eccentricity. They continued to underestimate the woman behind the pressed flowers, never suspecting that the very fabric of their carefully woven deceit was being systematically unpicked, thread by deliberate thread. One blustery Tuesday, A week before the looming environmental compliance review deadline I'd noted in my private journal, I found myself drawn towards Arthur's study. I was ostensibly searching for a book of old poetry, a perfectly innocent pursuit. But as I neared the closed door, voices, sharp and agitated, cut through the quiet hum of the house. It was Arthur and Brenda, their tones hushed but laced with undeniable stress. "This new plant is a nightmare, Brenda," Arthur's voice hissed, a low growl. "These environmental regulations are tighter than a drum. If that review goes south, Vance Enterprises could be looking at a fine that would make our big W evaporate." Brenda's response was clipped. "But we took care of the major liability, didn't we? The cottage trust." Mr. Albright assured me that once it was folded into Vance Enterprises, any potential historical issues connected to that lakeside plot were neatly contained. That was the whole point of Blackwood and Associates handling the preliminary work, wasn't it? To make sure everything was clean before Sterling and Company finalized the administrative transfer. "You said it yourself, it was essential for the government contract." My blood turned to ice. Contained. Preliminary work. Essential for the government contract. The words hit me like stones dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of chilling clarity through my mind. It wasn't about an outdated trust or administrative ease. It was a calculated maneuver, a legal sleight of hand to shield Vance Enterprises from the very real environmental liabilities of the newly acquired plant. My beloved cottage, my family's legacy, wasn't just a burden, it was collateral, an asset to be manipulated, its legal structure dismantled to serve Arthur's ambition. My late husband's bulletproof trust had been meticulously breached, not for a simple streamlining, but to create a legal shield, a financial buffer against the potential ruin of Arthur's grand ventures. The thin veil they had draped over their greed, spun from words like oversight and modernization, ripped apart before my eyes. What lay beneath was a cold, stark landscape of deliberate malice, a willingness to sacrifice my comfort, my memories, and my husband's legacy for their own financial gain. The air in the hallway felt suddenly suffocating, yet through it, I felt an almost electric surge of resolve. The game was no longer theoretical. It was real, chillingly so, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my ledger of facts was no longer just a collection of proof. It was the weapon I would wield. The shock from Arthur's study had solidified into a cold, clear determination. My quiet trap was no longer just for gathering information, it was becoming a strategic launchpad. I had moved beyond documenting their deceit, it was time to nudge them, ever so gently, into their own unraveling. My pieces were laid out on the board, and I, the underestimated player, was ready to make my first move. The environmental compliance review deadline for Vance Enterprises loomed, a phantom menace that only Arthur and Brenda truly understood. Their usual strained cheer at dinner had frayed into barely disguised anxiety. This was my moment. At Sunday dinner, a ritual they maintained only for appearances, Brenda started complaining about the rising costs of property insurance, specifically mentioning old family assets. Arthur grunted in agreement, too distracted by the news on his phone to fully engage. Owen, as always, picked at his food, a silent observer. "Oh, speaking of old assets," I began, my voice light, as if a pleasant memory had just floated to the surface. "I was just thinking about the cottage. Remember that old shed down by the lake, Arthur? The one where your father used to keep his old fishing gear? It was quite rustic, always had a bit of a damp smell. We often wondered if the foundation was entirely sound, especially with the runoff from the hill." I paused, taking a sip of water, allowing the words to hang in the air, seemingly innocent. Arthur looked up, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Mother, that shed was taken down years ago. It's irrelevant, was it, dear?" I asked, feigning absent-mindedness. My memory isn't what it used to be. I just recall Father always fretting about it, especially after that small oil spill in the lake from old Mr. Henderson's boat. He was so particular about environmental responsibility, always made sure everything was pristine around the cottage grounds, even the things no one else noticed. Such a shame to lose such a quaint old structure, isn't it? Full of character. I watched Owen. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. A faint shadow crossed his face, a momentary shift that spoke volumes. He remembered. He remembered the shed, and perhaps, the underlying concerns. Arthur cleared his throat, a forced, hearty sound. Yes, well, father was very thorough. All taken care of. He exchanged a quick, tense glance with Brenda. She had stopped buttering her roll. The subject was dropped, but not before I saw a new kind of worry etch itself onto Arthur's face. The seed was planted. The old shed, a barely remembered structure, now carried the weight of a hidden threat, a possible undeclared historical liability that could unravel their carefully constructed containment. Their dismissiveness was cracking, revealing the anxiety beneath. My silent partner, my scrapbook ledger, now had an active role in their drama. The air in the sunroom was still, heavy with the quiet anticipation of a carefully planned act. My resolve, hardened by Arthur and Brenda's callous disregard, was now a finely tuned instrument. The scrapbook ledger lay closed, but its pages hummed with the secrets I had meticulously catalogued. The date for Vance Enterprises' environmental compliance review was fast approaching, a noose tightening around their carefully constructed deceit. This wasn't a moment for confrontation, but for a gentle, almost imperceptible nudge that would send their carefully balanced house of cards tumbling. I had spent days sifting through old boxes in the attic, those forgotten repositories of my husband's meticulous paperwork. Arthur had always dismissed them as father's old obsessiveness, but I knew better. My husband had been thorough, anticipating every potential pitfall. Deep within a dust-covered filing box, labeled Cottage, Property and Upkeep, I found it, an original property survey from the year after we bought the lake house, complete with detailed topographical maps and a preliminary environmental assessment. The survey clearly depicted the old shed, noting its original construction materials and, crucially, a minor, long-resolved issue concerning runoff and a small patch of contaminated soil from an old fuel tank near Mr. Henderson's property line. It was all neatly documented, along with a certificate of environmental remediation, signed and sealed decades ago. This document, a mere scrap of paper in their eyes, held the key. It confirmed the shed's existence and a historical environmental concern, directly contradicting Arthur's dismissive, irrelevant claim. More importantly, it established a historical precedent for environmental liability on that specific land, liabilities Arthur and Brenda believed they had contained by dissolving the trust. They assumed those long-resolved issues were safely buried with my husband's careful records, now transferred into Vance Enterprises. They were wrong. My husband's meticulousness was about to become their undoing. That evening, I approached Arthur in the living room, where he was engrossed in his tablet. Brenda was busy on a call about charity gala seating arrangements. "Arthur, dear," I said, my voice soft, almost a sigh, "I was tidying up the attic, and I found this old folder. It seems to be some of your father's old cottage documents. I thought, with all this talk of environmental reviews for your new plant, perhaps some of the old land surveys and historical information might be helpful. You know, just in case there's anything to declare about the cottage plot, since it's now part of your company. Better to be over-prepared, don't you think?" I handed him the folder, its contents carefully arranged, the old survey prominently on top. His brow furrowed with mild annoyance, but he took it, placing it carelessly on the coffee table. He saw an old woman offering a harmless tidbit. He didn't see the carefully set trap, the fuse already lit. The truth, long silenced, was about to ignite itself. The house was unnaturally quiet that afternoon, a false calm before a storm I had meticulously summoned. Arthur paced the living room, a predator caught in a cage, the old property survey and certificate of remediation clutched in his hand. Brenda sat rigid on the sofa, her carefully arranged facade crumbling around the edges. Owen was there too, summoned by Arthur, his face a pale mask of unease. The environmental review deadline was tomorrow. "Mother," Arthur began, his voice strained, a wire stretched taut. This old document. You found it in the attic?" He held up the certificate, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. "This states there was a previous environmental issue. A asterisk remediated issue, yes, but still an issue. If this surfaces now, with the new plant, with that government contract demanding absolute transparency." He trailed off, his gaze darting to Brenda, who looked as if she might be ill. I said nothing. My presence was enough. I walked calmly to the coffee table, where my favorite scrapbook lay, thick and heavy with its quiet truths. I opened it to the very first page of my modern entries, the one where I had first noted Arthur's vague dismissal of the cottage trust. With slow, deliberate movements, I turned the pages. First, the faded photograph of the cottage, a serene image of an earlier, more innocent time. Beside it, my neat inscription, Mr. Albright, Sterling and Company, Tuesday, 9 a.m. last month. Arthur's oversight, explained away. Next, the yellowed newspaper clipping about Vance Enterprises acquiring the manufacturing plant in October, highlighting the government contract and, crucially, the strict environmental compliance requirement. Underneath, my tiny pencil notation, compliance review deadline imminent. Then, the receipt from the celebratory dinner, the almost invisible logo of Blackwood and Associates gleaming under the light. Below it, in my steady hand, Arthur's boast, big win, quick restructuring, late October. Birthday dinner, legal work by Blackwood and Associates. I turned another page. There, carefully taped, was a summary of my overheard conversation from Arthur's study, the chilling words about the cottage trust being dissolved to contain potential historical liabilities, essential for the government contract. My own words underlined in red ink, my cottage was collateral. My legacy, their shield. And finally, I laid open the page that combined all the threads. A faded photograph of the old shed, the one Arthur claimed was irrelevant. Beside it, a copy of the very property survey he now held, detailing the runoff, the contaminated soil, the minor oil spill from Mr. Henderson's boat. And, most importantly, the clear, undeniable copy of the asterisk certificate of environmental remediation asterisk. Proving that my father had addressed the issue thoroughly, decades ago, but also serving as irrefutable proof that this historical liability existed and was known. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the frantic beat of my own heart. Arthur's face was a roadmap of dawning horror. His plan, his meticulously constructed shield, had become his sword. By dissolving the trust and subsuming the cottage property into Vance Enterprises to contain these old liabilities, he had effectively brought all its history, including this previously resolved, but now re-exposed, environmental detail, directly under the scrutiny of his company's imminent compliance review. The certificate, intended to show resolution, now proved knowledge of a historical issue he tried to bury, which would look like a deliberate attempt at non-disclosure if the new plant's review failed. His attempt to avoid liability had made him catastrophically vulnerable. Brenda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the pages. The carefully crafted persona of the supportive wife shattered, revealing raw fear. Owen, who had been trying to shrink into the armchair, visibly flinched, a silent plea in his eyes, but I gave him nothing. My gaze held steady, unwavering. They had seen an old woman, lost in her pastimes. They had seen a harmless hobby. What they now saw, laid out before them page by page, was an indisputable chronicle of their calculated dishonesty, their reckless disregard for family, and their imminent downfall. My scrapbooks were no longer merely memories, they were the quiet trap sprung. The silence that followed my presentation in the living room was not one of peace, but of utter combustion. Arthur, his face a mask of furious, dawning panic, snatched up the folder with the old survey and the remediation certificate, then swept the scrapbooks from the coffee table, scattering them to the floor. Brenda shrieked, a raw, undignified sound that tore through the veneer of her usual composure. Owen, bless his complicit heart, simply rose and vanished, melting into the shadows of the hallway without a word, like mist before the sun. I watched them, unmoving, as the ripples began. Arthur barked orders at Brenda, his voice sharp with accusations. You said this was contained. Albright assured you. Brenda retorted, her face blotchy. He said it was preliminary. You rushed everything for that wretched contract. Their carefully constructed alliance, built on shared greed, fractured instantly under the weight of their self-inflicted disaster. The meticulously kept house, usually a symphony of order, now echoed with their desperate, whispered arguments. I heard Arthur on the phone for hours that night, his voice rising and falling in desperate pleas to lawyers, to consultants, to anyone who could undo the knot he had tied around his own neck. The environmental compliance review was not going to be a simple formality, it was now a minefield. My husband's thoroughness, once dismissed as obsessive, was now a ghost haunting Arthur's hurried schemes. The certificate of remediation, intended by father to show resolution, would now, in light of their attempted containment, scream non-disclosure. The following days were a slow-motion unraveling. The newspapers, my discreet source of public information, carried subtle shifts. A small article noted potential delays for Vance Enterprises' new government contract due to unforeseen administrative complexities. Then came the rumors, picked up by a business column, about a historical environmental concern at a recently acquired property, raising questions about due diligence. Brenda, usually bustling, became a wraith, her attempts at maintaining social appearances collapsing. She cancelled charity galas, citing family matters, a phrase that, in our circles, was always code for something far messier. Her social standing, so meticulously curated, began to fray. I saw her once, staring out a window, her reflection a stranger to her former self, the fear still etched into her features. Owen, surprisingly, sought me out a few days later. He found me in my sunroom, carefully retaping a photograph that had come loose from a scrapbook page during Arthur's fit. He offered a halting apology, a jumble of words about being pressured and not fully understanding. I merely nodded, offering no absolution, no harsh words. His easy path had become a thorny one, and the silence from Brenda and Arthur now left him truly exposed, no longer able to simply agree. I felt no triumph, no elation. Only a quiet sense of finality, like the last chord of a long, somber piece of music. The truth, in its understated power, had done its work. They had believed they were too clever, too insulated by their positions and their lawyers. But they had overlooked the oldest truth. That lies, no matter how carefully constructed, always leave a trail, and my scrapbooks, once a quiet comfort, had become that trail, leading them directly to their own reckoning. The dust, metaphorical and literal from Arthur's fit of rage, began to settle. The grand house, once filled with their performative cheer, then with their panicked arguments, now held a new kind of quiet, a space where I could finally breathe. My scrapbooks, scattered across the floor, were now carefully collected, their pages smoothed, their integrity restored. They had served their purpose, illuminating the darkness, and now, they would guide me in charting a new course for myself. News of Vance Enterprises' troubles spread like wildfire through the local business community. The government contract, a jewel in Arthur's crown, was officially under review, its future uncertain due to unresolved environmental disclosures. The fines were substantial, the legal battles threatening to drain Arthur's carefully hoarded resources. He was spending more time with his lawyers, his face perpetually drawn, his bluster replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. Brenda, in turn, retreated. The charity circuit, her social playground, became a hostile landscape. The whispered gossip had turned into outright avoidance, and the meticulously curated facade she had presented to the world had truly shattered. They were isolated, no longer at the apex of their self-made social mountain, but marooned in its desolate foothills. My focus, however, was not on their downfall, but on my own quiet resurgence. The summer cottage, the very heart of their betrayal, became my first act of reclamation. With Arthur's legal mess, the transfer of the property into Vance Enterprises was now deeply complicated, and the lawyers involved, Mr. Albright included, were in damage control. I made it clear, through a discreet but firm letter to Sterling and Company, that while I held no personal grudge, I simply wished for the cottage to revert to its original trust structure, protecting it from any further administrative streamlining by Vance Enterprises. The legal intricacies were beyond me, but the principle was clear. It was a firm boundary, drawn not with anger, but with the quiet authority of someone who had seen too much. Owen, surprisingly, became a quiet ally, albeit a hesitant one. He often dropped by, sometimes bringing a small plant for my sunroom, sometimes just sitting in silence. His eyes held a new kind of sobriety. He had, at least, glimpsed the precipice. I allowed him to sit, to witness my quiet rebuilding, without demands or expectations. I began to clear out the colder, grander rooms of the house, those monuments to Brenda's modern taste. Not with anger, but with a serene detachment. Pieces of furniture, once sources of tension, were sold or donated. The walls, stripped of their sleek, impersonal art, now felt ready for something new, something mine. My late husband's study, which Arthur had claimed as his own, was returned to its original purpose as a library, a quiet space of reflection and knowledge, no longer a den of deceit. This was not about vengeance, but about cultivation. I was tending to my own garden, planting seeds of peace and independence. The silence in the house, once a sign of my invisibility, was now the fertile ground for my own flourishing. The sun warmed my face in the sunroom, a gentle, steady heat that mirrored the tranquility in my heart. The house around me, no longer a monument to Brenda's sleek modernity or Arthur's imposing presence, had truly become my home again. The heavy, formal furniture was gone, replaced by pieces that spoke of comfort and light. My late husband's study, restored to its purpose as a library, now invited me to linger among books, their pages unburdened by hidden agendas. It was a space to live, not just to exist, Arthur and Brenda. Their names no longer carried the sting they once did. The consequences of their choices had unfolded, a slow, inevitable avalanche. Vance Enterprises, burdened by fines and the ongoing legal battles from the environmental disclosures, had lost the government contract, the very big win Arthur had so arrogantly celebrated. His empire, built on ambition and deceit, was not entirely shattered, but it was certainly diminished, its foundations deeply cracked. He was still Arthur, driven by acquisition, but now he moved with a haunted air, the swagger gone, replaced by the weight of his own miscalculations. I heard whispers, through the ever-present channels of local gossip, that his relationship with Brenda was colder than the grand rooms she had once so carefully curated. Her social standing had indeed evaporated. The charity galas now proceeded without her, her name quietly removed from all prominent committees. She was a ghost of her former self, haunting the periphery of a world that had once worshipped her image. They were bound by their shared wreckage, adrift in a sea of their own making, a future without the solace of genuine connection or respect. I offered no forgiveness, nor did they seek it. The scales had simply balanced. The cottage, my beloved lakeside retreat, had indeed reverted to its original trust structure, legally disentangled from Vance Enterprises' troubles. It stood once more as a beacon of family history, protected by the very foresight Arthur had scorned. It was a place I could visit again, not just in my memories, but in tangible reality, where the lake breeze carried only the scent of pine, not the stench of betrayal. Owen still visited, a shy, almost contrite presence. He never again spoke of being pressured or not understanding. Instead, he helped me tend my small herb garden, his hands surprisingly gentle as he dug in the earth. He listened more than he spoke, and in his quiet company, I found a different kind of solace. He carried the burden of his complicity, but he seemed to be finding his own way out of the shadows. He was not part of my vengeance, but he was a witness to my liberation, and in that, a quiet understanding had formed between us, a fragile bridge built on honesty. Looking back, I realized the scrapbooks hadn't just exposed them, they had liberated me. They were no longer a covert weapon or a silent trap. They were a testament to the strength I hadn't known I possessed, to the power of truth, and to the profound peace that came from reclaiming my own narrative. The pages, filled with faded photographs and precise notes, told a story not just of betrayal, but of vindication, of quiet resolve against overwhelming odds. Each entry was a step on my path, charting a course towards a future where I was no longer overlooked, no longer silenced. My new chapter was not written in anger or despair, but in the serene, unshakable certainty of a life finally, profoundly, and irrevocably, my own. Eleanor's story, my scrapbooks. The quiet trap that set me free, truly resonates with the core of what we explore here at Vengeful Echoes. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't always loud or confrontational. Sometimes, it's found in the quiet corners, in the overlooked details, and in the methodical piecing together of forgotten truths. Her journey from quiet suffering to strategic vindication, without ever succumbing to bitterness, shows us the profound liberation that comes from reclaiming one's narrative. It proves that justice can be served not through grand gestures, but through unwavering resolve and the undeniable weight of facts. What a testament to the power within an underestimated heart, finally finding its own flourishing ground. If Eleanor's journey has sparked a flicker of recognition in your own heart, if you too believe in the quiet power of truth to set us free, then you've found your home here. We're dedicated to bringing you more stories of resilience, justice, and the sweet echo of vindication. Don't miss another tale. Please consider liking this video, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing to Vengeful Echoes for more narratives that prove quiet strength can move mountains. Until next time, may your days be filled with health, your family bonds be truly nurturing, and may you always find moments of profound happiness in the chapters of your own beautiful life.